They said the door hadn't been opened in over 50 years, dust clinging to brass knobs like memories refusing to fade, hinges groaning with the bitter protest of something disturbed from profound sleep. Princeton maintenance had received their orders for archival restoration, nothing unusual at first glance, nothing to suggest that history was about to crack open and spill its most guarded secret. But hidden behind a false panel in the back of an office closet, where time itself seemed to have forgotten to move forward, waited a small steel case that bore no institutional markings, carried no inventory number, contained no explanations. Inside lay only one object, a reel-to-reel magnetic tape dated April 1951, marked in fading ink with words that would change everything we thought we knew about the man who taught us that time was an illusion. Nicht für Veröffentlichung, i.e., not for publication. Its very existence was immediately classified, the content flagged as a security risk by Cold War intelligence services, sealed under governmental order like a nuclear secret too dangerous for daylight. It passed in whispers from archivist to academic, behind locked doors and knowing glances, spoken about in hushed tones but never confirmed, never acknowledged, never admitted to exist. Until now. With the death of the final custodian and the digital resurrection of Einstein's Princeton archives in 2024, the tape was accidentally uploaded, mirrored to an open access server in what can only be described as history's most consequential clerical error. It went unnoticed for mere hours until one doctoral student, scrolling through seemingly mundane academic files, recognized something that made her blood run cold: the voice. There is no introduction on this recording, no formal greeting, no careful setup for posterity. The audio clicks on mid-sentence like an interruption into a conversation that had been echoing through the corridors of genius for years, decades perhaps. The man's voice is weary but unmistakable, carrying that heavy German accent we all remember, that deliberate cadence that once explained the curvature of spacetime to a world still catching its breath from the implications. But this is not the public Einstein we thought we knew, not the patent clerk turned saint of science, not the cheerful icon captured forever at blackboards covered in equations. This voice is older, slower, haunted by something far more profound than the weight of splitting atoms. This is the voice of a man who discovered something that terrified him more than the bomb itself. Albert Einstein, born in Ulm 1879, Nobel laureate, architect of relativity, the mind that redefined time and space and taught us that gravity was not a force but the very shape of the universe bending around mass and energy. He gave humanity the tools to unlock the atom and with it, the terrible moral burden of potential apocalypse. He warned against totalitarianism, fled the rising darkness of Nazi Germany, spent his final decades walking Princeton's quiet tree-lined paths, always searching, always reaching for that elusive final theory, the equation that would unite all forces, the mathematical key to existence itself. The God equation, he once called it with characteristic irony. But until now, no one knew that the last question Einstein wrestled with in the shadows of his towering legacy wasn't about the fundamental fabric of matter or energy. It was about the fate of the human soul. The voice on this tape is not delivering a lecture to eager students or explaining complex theories to curious journalists. This is confessional, private, intimate, in a way that feels almost invasive to hear.
Before we continue, if the unknown calls to you, if you seek evidence of what waits beyond the veil, you're not alone. We uncover what was buried, silenced, or forgotten. Like this video to help us keep digging. Subscribe for more truths the world was never meant to see. Share it before this too disappears. Now, back to the story.
The interviewer's identity remains unknown, no name spoken, the few interjections distorted, possibly altered in post-recording manipulation. Einstein speaks as though the microphone is his last companion, in a world growing smaller around him, the walls of reality closing in. War has left him profoundly disillusioned, science transformed from his first love into an instrument of death, and yet here, at the twilight of his extraordinary life, he claims to have glimpsed something that defied even his lifelong, bone-deep skepticism. Not faith, not mysticism, not the comfortable delusions of desperate hope. Evidence. A pattern buried within the very equations that made him famous. A presence embedded in the geometry of space-time itself. The recording begins with him referencing a lecture at the Franklin Institute in 1934, where he had casually joked that time was merely an illusion, but here on this forgotten tape, the joking is stopped entirely. He speaks about a moment that occurred decades earlier, in the dark days following the death of his first wife, Mileva, describing what he calls simply an event, something he never shared with colleagues, never published, never admitted to experiencing. A phenomenon he later tried desperately to model using the tensor mathematics of general relativity, and that's when the recording shifts, becomes something else entirely, something that makes the listener lean forward despite themselves. I do not say this lightly. His voice carries the weight of someone who has spent years questioning his own sanity, but there is structure beyond the termination of life. The body stops, yes, this much is obvious, but the field does not. He refers repeatedly to the field, and at first it seems he means the unified field theory that consumed his later years, the mathematical holy grail that would unite electromagnetism with gravity. But the way he speaks of it here is different, more intimate, more reverent, as though he's describing something alive. He describes spacetime not as the empty void most imagine, but as an imprint medium, a surface on which consciousness itself may leave permanent deformation. Just as mass warps the fabric of gravity, he suggests with growing conviction, the very act of awareness, of being conscious and alive and thinking, may leave an echo in the universe, a gravitational memory that persists long after the body returns to dust. He draws a comparison that sends chills down the spine. Consider a supernova. It explodes with violence beyond imagination, but the light does not simply cease to exist. The wave persists, diluted across vast distances, yes, but never fully gone, never truly lost. It travels through space and time, carrying information about what once was. The interviewer asks whether he means this metaphorically, and the silence that follows stretches like pulled taffy. When Einstein speaks again, his voice carries no doubt whatsoever. I mean mathematically. He cites correspondence from 1947 with Schrödinger, letters redacted from published collections but preserved in his private papers, debates about time symmetry and relativity, the notion that if physical equations are truly symmetrical, then nothing in nature need be unidirectional, not even death itself. Einstein insists he discovered a paradox, an asymmetry not in time but in its perception, consciousness moving forward because it remains bound to entropy, while the geometry of the universe requires no such limitation. Then he drops a phrase that appears nowhere in his public works: inverted time continuity. A loop, a resonance, a form of identity persistence that does not depend on flesh and blood, but on geodesics, the paths through space-time carved by mind's interaction with reality. The interviewer asks a question hanging in the air like smoke. Is he claiming that ghosts are real? Einstein sighs with the weight of worlds. I do not like that word. It is primitive terminology for something sophisticated beyond current understanding. I am not speaking of hauntings or supernatural nonsense. I am speaking of residual topology, the mathematics of memory embedded in spacetime itself. The difference between 0 and 1 is not disappearance, it is transformation. There is more, so much more. He describes experiments conducted in absolute secrecy, perhaps at the Institute, perhaps elsewhere entirely. A modified Michelson interferometer built not to detect gravitational waves, but what he calls emotional resonance, vibrations in the quantum field that correlated not with physical motion, but with human mourning. He tracked fluctuations in vacuum energy around sites of recent death, measured perturbations in the quantum foam that underlies reality. There was always a signal, he says, voice barely above a whisper. Faint, yes, but unmistakably there. He never published these findings, feared ridicule from the scientific community he had spent his life serving. More importantly, he feared misuse by those who would exploit such knowledge. I witnessed what they accomplished with the atom, he murmurs with profound regret. Can you imagine what they would do with proof of the soul's persistence? The tape degrades in several critical spots, gaps that seem almost too convenient, possibly deliberate censorship of the most sensitive revelations. But what remains is staggering not in its certainty, but in its raw, vulnerable humanity. This was not a man claiming absolute knowledge of life after death. This was genius asking whether the universe itself remembers us after we're gone. The interviewer poses one final question that hangs in the air like a prayer. If this is true, if consciousness truly persists in some mathematical form, what actually happens when we die? Einstein pauses, and in that silence lives every human fear and hope about mortality. The room holds its breath, the ancient reel continuing to turn. You fall out of time, he says at last, words carrying the weight of cosmic truth. But not out of space. In the quiet corners of history, where genius meets mortality, There exists a recording that defies everything we thought we knew about death itself. The voice belongs to Albert Einstein, but this is not the gentle professor we remember from textbooks. This is a man wrestling with the darkest implications of his own discoveries, speaking truths too dangerous for public consumption. The reel clicks forward, carrying with it the weight of revelations that could reshape our understanding of existence. Einstein's voice emerges from the static, quieter now, as if he understands that the gravity of his words could tilt the world off its axis. He begins by invoking the cornerstone of his legacy, the constancy of light. In both special and general relativity, no matter how fast you travel through the cosmos, light moves at the same unalterable speed. But hidden within that elegant principle, concealed in plain sight like a shadow cast by brilliance itself, lies something far more disturbing. Time, he reveals, is not the linear progression we experience in our daily lives. It is relational, a web of interconnected moments that exist simultaneously across the fabric of spacetime. And if this fundamental truth holds, then death is not an ending at all, but merely a coordinate in the vast geometry of existence. The scientist speaks with clinical precision, stripping away romantic notions with surgical efficiency. He does not believe in a soul, at least not as religion defines it with its promises of ethereal immortality. But he believes in something far more concrete and terrifying: the field. This invisible lattice that underlies all reality, he claims, records everything. Every thought, every action, every moment of consciousness leaves its mark on the fundamental structure of the universe, like footprints in cosmic sand. He speaks of Michel A. Besso, his lifelong friend and confidant, whose death in 1955 would become the catalyst for Einstein's most profound and hidden revelation. In his famous public letter, Einstein wrote that for believing physicists, the distinction between past, present, and future is only a stubbornly persistent illusion. But what he admits here, captured forever on magnetic tape, is something he never dared say aloud. When news of Besso's death reached him, every clock in his Princeton home stopped for exactly 42 seconds. Initially, he dismissed it as a local power fault, a coincidence of failing infrastructure. But later, driven by the compulsion that defines all great scientists, he calculated the gravitational potential of the moon during that precise week. The numbers aligned with terrifying precision. The lag in time corresponded exactly to the celestial mechanics above. He speaks of this event, not with the superstition of the desperate, but with the cold suspicion of a mind that has glimpsed the true architecture of reality. His voice gains momentum as he reveals his most secret work, a hidden body of research conducted between 1948 and 1950. These were not the unification theories that scholars would later assume, but something far more radical: equations that modeled the continuity of experience beyond death. Through years of calculations hidden in tensor shorthand, Einstein had come to suspect that death was not the collapse of being but its expansion. The moment when the local self dissolves and merges with a larger field of informational geometry, like a drop of water returning to an infinite ocean while maintaining its essential pattern. He builds upon the work of Hermann Wall, the brilliant mathematician who conceived of the world as a four-dimensional manifold, where what we perceive as fleeting moments are merely cross-sections of an eternal block. Einstein extends this concept into territories that challenge our most basic assumptions about mortality. The death of the body, he explains, is simply the observer's exit from their localized vector in spacetime. We do not vanish into nothingness. We decohere, spreading across dimensions we cannot perceive while alive. To illustrate this concept, he offers an analogy that cuts through the complexity with elegant simplicity. Imagine a photon striking a prism. From one perspective, the light splits into a spectrum of colors, seeming to fragment and scatter. From another viewpoint, the light continues unchanged, merely revealing properties that were always present. The prism, in Einstein's framework, is death itself, not an annihilation, but a transformation of state space that reveals hidden dimensions of existence. Picture a being made of pure light who cannot perceive the prism, only the beam. To such a creature, the splitting would appear to be an illusion, but the resulting spectrum would be undeniably real. When the interviewer challenges him, suggesting these are merely metaphors dressed in scientific language, Einstein's voice rises for the first time with passionate conviction. This is not metaphor, he insists. This is topology. This is physics in its purest form. The patterns he observed emerged from modeling consciousness not as a mere byproduct of neural activity, but as an emergent property of path dependency in spacetime itself. Our identity, our very essence, is not simply the result of brain chemistry, but the specific trajectory we carve through the universe. Every choice made, every observation recorded, every quantum entanglement formed creates an indelible path that cannot be erased, only extended or folded into higher dimensions. This leads him back to the infamous EPR paradox, the paper he co-wrote with Podolsky and Rosen in 1935 to argue against quantum entanglement. Publicly, he had called it spooky action at a distance, dismissing it as an impossibility that violated local realism. Privately, the implications had terrified him. But decades later, captured in this hidden recording, he reveals his return to the EPR paper with revolutionary insight. What if entanglement was not merely a quantum quirk to be explained away, but a fundamental structural law of reality? What if, once two systems become entangled, they can never fully disentangle, not even in death? He conceives of the mind as a causal chain, an echo chamber of decisions, perceptions, and regrets that reverberates through spacetime. This leads to a question that chills the very foundations of materialism. If we are the cumulative result of our entire past, where does that vast collection of experiences go when we die? Einstein believed the field preserved it all, maintaining a perfect record of every conscious moment, like an eternal library written in the language of curved spacetime. Though he offers no equations in this recording, he references unpublished notebooks allegedly sent to a physicist in Zurich, whose identity remains redacted from surviving correspondence. These documents supposedly contain calculations attempting to model the information surface that forms at the moment of death, analogous to the event horizon of a black hole, a boundary where the inside becomes inaccessible to outside observers, but remains perfectly preserved within the structure of space-time itself. His tone softens as personal pain bleeds through scientific objectivity. He reflects on his children, particularly his daughter Liesl, who vanished from public record entirely. Historians speculate she died young or was given up for adoption, but Einstein never spoke of her publicly. Here, in this moment of vulnerability, he whispers that if she had passed away, he would like to believe her imprint still curves the field around her memory. You can hear the ache in his voice, the longing of a father grasping at hope through the only tool he truly trusted, mathematics. He quotes Spinoza, the philosopher who shaped his early thinking. All things are in God, and God is in all things. But then he pauses, and his definition of divinity emerges stripped of all religious sentiment. God, to Einstein, is not a being with consciousness and will, but the geometry itself. The fundamental structure that underlies all existence, the invisible lattice upon which reality is woven. The recording takes a darker turn as Einstein explores the shadow side of his theory. If the field retains all curvature, all patterns of existence, then it remembers cruelty with the same fidelity as kindness. He warns of topological scars, regions of high energetic trauma embedded permanently in the fabric of space-time, persisting long after the perpetrators have died. These wounds in reality itself could influence future events, creating pockets of disturbance that ripple through generations. History, he suggests, is not merely remembered, but physically encoded in the universe's structure. Perhaps the most disturbing implication of his entire theory follows. Some places, some people, may resonate with the residue of moral action, burned into space-time like scars on cosmic film. We speak casually of heaven and hell as destinations awaiting us after death, but Einstein proposes something far more unsettling. What if these are not places at all, but regions of space-time itself? What if the field contains gradients of coherence and dissonance, areas where the harmony of existence has been permanently disrupted by acts of profound evil, or elevated by moments of transcendent good? As the recording continues, Einstein's breathing becomes labored, a reminder that these words were captured near the end of his life when illness was already claiming him. Yet he persists, driven by the compulsion to share what he has discovered. The scientist seeks symmetry in the equations he observes, the elegant beauty of mathematical truth. But the human being seeks something far more elusive and precious, meaning, the interviewer, sensing the weight of these revelations, asks the question that haunts every conscious being. Do we meet again after death? Einstein does not answer immediately. The silence stretches across decades, carrying with it the full weight of genius confronting mortality. Finally, his voice emerges from the quiet, carrying a conviction that transcends scientific methodology and touches something deeper. He believes, with the certainty that only comes from a lifetime of studying the universe's deepest secrets, that we never truly part from those we love. In the hidden dimensions of spacetime, in the eternal record of the field itself, every connection forged in life persists beyond death. This is not the comfort of religion, but the cold mathematics of eternity itself, suggesting that love and loss are merely different faces of the same cosmic constant, written forever in the geometry of existence. In the dying moments of a damaged reel, through the static and warbled echoes of time itself, we hear the voice of the man who rewrote reality. The tape hisses with age, its magnetic soul surrendering to entropy, yet the words emerge with startling clarity, as if the universe itself refuses to let them fade. This is not the Einstein of textbooks or monuments. This is a mind unmoored from certainty, drifting toward the deepest questions that haunt the edge of human understanding. He begins not with mathematics, but with memory, the eclipse of 1919. Arthur Eddington's photographs proving that starlight bends around the sun, confirming what general relativity had whispered years before. The reporters gathered like vultures around revelation, asking if he was surprised by the results. His answer had been swift, almost dismissive. No, he would have been surprised if it had not turned out that way. But decades later, in the intimacy of this forgotten recording, he reveals what no telegram ever captured, what no newspaper ever printed. In that moment of triumph, alone with the data that would reshape civilization's understanding of space and time, something else had stirred. Looking up at the darkened sky, he felt not vindication, but presence, a pressure that seemed to emanate not from the cosmos, but from within his own consciousness, as if the universe had suddenly become aware of itself, watching through his eyes. The revelation haunts everything that follows. What if, he wonders aloud, our theories are not discoveries at all, but recollections? What if the equations we scratch onto blackboards are memories of a deeper truth, fragments of awareness that predate our individual existence? The tape crackles as he shifts in his chair, the sound like distant lightning, and then he offers what he calls his final formulation, words that appear nowhere else in his published works, thoughts too dangerous or too profound for academic discourse. There are no complete equations here, no mathematical proofs to satisfy the empiricists. Instead, there is something more unsettling, the suggestion that consciousness is not housed within the brain like a pilot in a cockpit, but exists as a localized standing wave in the vast field of reality itself. We are, in his haunting phrase, the moment the wave reflects back upon itself, awareness catching its own reflection in the mirror of spacetime. If this is true, he warns with quiet intensity, then death is not what we imagine it to be. It is neither silence nor sleep, neither darkness nor rest. It is diffusion, the dissolution of a pattern back into the infinite symphony from which it emerged. He returns to light, that faithful metaphor that has guided his entire career, but now he speaks not of visible beams racing through the void, but of photons themselves, those quantum ghosts that exist as probability clouds until the moment they are observed, when they collapse into singular reality. The field of existence, he suggests, behaves similarly, structuring itself around the observer's presence like iron filings aligning with a magnet. Life becomes a phase of localized organization, consciousness, the force that shapes reality through the very act of witnessing it, and when the observer vanishes, the structure remains, persistent as frost after dawn, measurable as the wake of a ship long after it has passed beyond the horizon. We are not ghosts haunting some ethereal realm, he insists with scientific precision. We are impressions, patterns pressed into the fabric of spacetime that retain their shape even after the force that created them has moved on. He acknowledges the danger in these thoughts, the way they will be twisted by mystics and dismissed by materialists, but he cannot escape the logical conclusion of his own work. If general relativity is true, if time is relative, and spacetime itself is malleable, then death is simply the loss of one coordinate on an infinite map that continues to exist in its entirety. Imagine a book, he offers, his voice taking on the cadence of a teacher addressing his final student. You read one line at a time, believing each line represents the present moment. But the book exists all at once, past, present, and future, bound together in a single object. Your life follows the same pattern, each moment a line in a story that has already been written in the geometry of the universe itself. The implications stretch beyond physics into the realm of ethics, transforming morality from philosophy into fundamental law. If the field retains what he calls emotional topography, if actions deform the geometry of collective experience, then every cruelty becomes an indentation in the fabric of reality, every kindness a resonance that ripples through the structure of existence itself. He speaks of the man who inverted light, his euphemism for Hitler, wondering if such concentrated evil could ever truly dissolve, or whether it leaves scars that persist for millennia like cosmic bruises. This understanding drove his refusal to participate in the atomic bomb's creation, not because it ends individual lives, but because it alters the field forever, writing destruction into the permanent record of human existence. In the tape's final moments, as the reel slows and his voice begins to warp with mechanical fatigue, Einstein reveals his deepest fear. Not death itself, but forgetting. The possibility that when consciousness dissolves back into the infinite field, there may be no anchor to preserve the love, the relationships, the beautiful mistakes that defined his individual existence. Yet even this terror yields to wonder. Perhaps the field itself is memory, he suggests, the universe's way of remembering every moment that has ever been lived. He quotes Rilke in his native German before translating, "Be ahead of all parting, as though it already were behind you." The final question comes like a prayer. What happens after? His answer, delivered through the growing static of a dying machine, offers not certainty, but hope. We rejoin the whole. The tape stops, but something persists. Not doctrine or dogma, but the echo of a voice that dared to imagine that in the deep, curved geometry of space and time, the field still sings with the music of everyone who has ever lived, everyone who has ever loved, everyone who has ever wondered at the magnificent mystery of simply being alive. This, and not a drill,